Hey everybody, this is your instructor Dylan, and I have a little example here that we can use to help us really better understand Chapter 3, 4, and 5, as it turns out. We can use it for all those skills. What I want you to do is pause the video, read through it kind of carefully. It's probably hard to do with me yapping at you. And then what I want you to do is schematize the argument, give the implicit question, and come up with two rivals. So pause the video, give it a shot. I hope you're doing it. Okay. And I hope you did it. And here we go. So here's how I did it, at least. I have the implicit question, what damaged the door? You could have worded that a number of ways. What caused the damage? Something like that would have worked too. My support is it was late at night. The door had gashes in it. Those gashes weren't there this morning. There were some clumps of brown fur near the bottom of the door. Our neighbor has a large brown dog, and the dog often escapes the yard. So the conclusion is the neighbor's dog damaged the damaged the door, as opposed to what? Well, as opposed to vandals doing it or some other animal doing it. Ranking, I think this is a sound and strong argument. I think C1 is clearly, for me at least, as I read the argument, I think C1's at the top of the list, and I think there's a little bit of a gap between C1 and C2, and then I think C3 as a rival is really just before or just below C2. Now, if this were Chapter 4, what we could do is we could look at the items of support and articulate their relevance. When I first schematized this argument, I did it in front of a class. In fact, it was a former student who created this narrative for me. It was really quite nice. I did it in front of a class, and I actually had S2 through S6. I didn't even list S1. And I had a student raise his hand and say, hey, listen, I had the fact that it was late at night in the support. And I said, well, how is that relevant, right? And this is what Chapter 4 allows us to do. It allows us to sort of say, be precise, why it's relevant. He said, well, I think the fact that it was late at night actually moves C2 up in the list a little bit. Without the fact that being late at night, maybe if it were the day, if I were only gone for a bit, I think vandals would be much lower in the list. And he's absolutely right? Good way to articulate the relevance of support. That's just using our Chapter 5, our Chapter 4 skill. What else would I say? Like S2 in the Chapter 4 language determines a list of rivals. S5 and S6 maybe increases the gap or even puts C1 on the list itself. What does S4 do? Clearly it changes the ranking by pushing C1 up in the list. So at any rate, that's the Chapter 4 language for articulating relevance. But when it comes to now talking about Chapter 5, what we want to do is we can actually articulate the diagnostic relevance of support. We can say a little bit more about why, the fact that it was late at night would push vandals up a little bit. We can actually sort of put better words to our judgments about that. In order to do that, though, the first thing that we're going to do is look at our support and figure out if it's trace data or non-trace data. Now, in a second, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause the video and have you do that. But just to kind of help you out, I don't know if this tip's going to work or not, or if it's going to be helpful, and if it's not, just ignore it. But here's what I do. I always look at my conclusions, right? C1, C2, and C3, all of my rivals together. And I know that each of those, like, it's just a sentence, right? The neighbor's dog damaged the door. But that's a fill-in for a whole story. It's like it's really a bare bones paraphrase of a whole story that I'm imagining. So I'm imagining the neighbor's dog getting out of the yard, right, coming over to my house and damaging the door. I'm also imagining maybe just some person doing that or some other animal coming out and damaging my door. Now the idea is in telling those stories, I ask myself, do I explain this item of support? And if any of the stories does explain it or could explain it, that's what makes it trace data. Another way to do it is sometimes I just ask a question. Like S1, it was late at night. Well, why was it late at night? Do any of my rivals, could they answer that question? And if the answer is no, it's non-trace data. If the answer is yes, it's trace data. All right, so let me pause the video, look at S1 through S6, figure out if it's trace or non-trace data. Okay, so I hope you did it. I hope you gave it a shot. So here we go. The first part, it was late at night. Well, that's non-trace data because none of our rivals will explain why it's late at night. Now, what about the door has gashes in it? Well, any of the rivals explain that? Well, I hope so. That's our trace data, absolutely. Those gashes weren't there this morning. Does anything explain that? Not really. None of our rivals explain that. That's non-trace data. There were some clumps of brown fur near the bottom of the door. Can anything explain that? Yeah, I think C1 explains it, as it turns out. So it's trace data. What about S5? Our neighbor has a large brown dog. Do any of our rivals explain why our neighbor has a large brown dog? No. What a weird explanation. Somebody says, "Oh, your neighbor has a large brown dog. Why is that?" Well, because vandals damaged my door. It doesn't really explain that. So that's non-trace data, as is S6. S6 is also non-trace data as well. But now what I want you to do, now that we've done that, is look at S1 through S6, and I want you to articulate the diagnostic relevance of these items of support according to the formula that we are learning here in Lecture 10 and in this unit. So this is like what we're doing on the discussion board as well. So let's look at this. So S1 through S6, you might pause the video again and try to articulate the diagnostic relevance, again, according to that formula in Lecture 10. So again, articulate the diagnostic relevance. Okay, here we go. So what does that look like? I hope you gave it a crack. Pause the video. If you haven't, pause it now. Do it. But here we go. S1, it was late at night. Well, that's non-trace data. What does that do? Well, I think that helps the C2 rival explain S2. So there we go. It's non-trace data B. What about S2? Well, that's our central trace data. All the rivals have to explain S2 or they're not rivals. Notice if you're not explaining S2, if the rival doesn't explain S2, it doesn't answer the implicit question, and if it doesn't answer the implicit question, it's just not a rival. So all the rivals must explain S2 in order to be rivals. It's central trace data. S3, this is a weird one. That's non-trace data A that shows that S2 needs to be explained. That's a weird one. We don't get that very often. And for my own private reasons, really tend not to like non-trace data A. What about S4? Well, it's trace data. We already have our central trace data. We'll only have one, so we know that's peripheral trace data that C1 actually easily explains. C1 easily explains S4. S5, our neighbor has a large brown dog. Well, the brown dog would help the C1 rival explain the brown fur. So S5 helps C1 explain S4, non-trace data B. And last but not least, S6, the dog often escapes the yard. Well, the fact that the dog often escapes the yard, I think, helps the C1 rival explain S2. So there we go, non-trace data B. Now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to try to come up on your own with new items of support and then articulate the diagnostic relevance. This is something I like to ask you to do. It's sort of good to test your imagination and your understanding this way. So there's a bit of a game involved to it. When you're coming up with new support, the first thing to do is don't deny or don't contradict any of the support that's already there. So you don't want to say, oh, S7, the door doesn't have gashes in it, or the gashes weren't new. Well, no, that's kind of going against the support as we have it. Let's just, for the sake of this class at least, just treat the support as true. And then what I want you to do is also avoid doing this. Don't just come up with a new item of support that affirms or denies a rival. Don't just say S7, it was vandals. Well, okay, great, but what made you think it was vandals? That's what we're after. So give it a try, and then whatever your new item of support is, the first thing to ask is this trace data or non-trace data, and then articulate the diagnostic relevance. So here we go. I'm just going to give you two here. The first one that I came up with is S7, the dog has attacked the door before. Now in the chapter 4 language, certainly that would increase the gap between C1 and C2, but why does it do that? Because I think it helps C1 explain S2. So there we go. Then the next one I came up with is this one. There are paw prints that are also on the door. Yeah, I think that would, and again in the chapter 4 language, that would also increase the gap between C1 and C2. But in chapter 5, is that trace data or non-trace data? Can we explain paw prints on the door? Well, yeah, C1 can. It's peripheral trace data that C1 easily explains. C1 easily explains that new item of support, F7. Okay, well, that was a lot of stuff. I hope that was helpful. And if not, you can leave me feedback. And I'll see you guys online.